From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Imagine the price of bread more than doubling. The rest of your food bill shooting up by 70% while your wages seem to be worth less than ever before. It was this backdrop of hyperinflation and the currency plummeting to a record low that finally forced shopkeepers and merchants in Tehran out onto the streets in furious protest. What started at the end of December as a demonstration in the bazaars of Iran's capital quickly spread as mass protests broke out across the country. For more than 2 weeks, tens of thousands of Iranians have taken to the streets, while government militias have launched a violent crackdown, killing hundreds of demonstrators. One protester spoke to The Times on condition of anonymity. Her words are voiced by a producer.
You cannot imagine how scary these people are. When you see them face to face, they try to reach for you, they attack you. But we don't have anything to lose anymore. I cannot stand breathing in the same air, sharing the same air with them anymore.
Despite the government crackdown and a nationwide internet blackout, the protests are continuing. Could this be the beginning of the end of the Iranian regime? Will the US and Israel intervene? And what would change look like in Iran? The story today, inside the Iranian protests.
My name's Gabrielle Weiniger. I've been covering the Middle East for The Times since around October the 7th, really, when everything changed with the Hamas attacks on Israel. And I've been living in the region in different places for over a decade. So I've been covering this for a long time.
Gabby, the protests in Iran have been building since they began on December the 28th. Give us a sense of the scale of them right now.
I think when we look at the scale, we can look at previous demonstrations, but we can also look at how it's grown over the past 2 weeks. It's now entering its third week. In the first few days, we saw the Bazaar merchants coming out in Tehran, telling one another to close shops, all about economic grievances and woes. And we also heard the regime, led by Ayatollah Khamenei, offering to negotiate with leaders, saying, we hear your economic grievances, we understand what you're going through. Let's talk, let's have reform, let's do negotiation. Over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 days, particularly since Thursday and the shutdown of the internet, there has been a sharp uptick in deaths and in violence. That means lethal suppression methods used by the Islamic regime and its anti-riot police under the cover of this communications blackout. The protests have not only spread and increased in violence, but also in locations. They've spread to over 100 cities. Iran's a huge country of 86 million people. This has spread to almost every single corner of Iran.
You've been covering these protests closely. You've been speaking to people since they began. Give us a sense of some of the people you're speaking to. What are they telling you about why they're going out to protest?
Well, all my contacts who I've been speaking to really since the June war, but also, before, given my background in the region, they've all gone offline for the last 4 days. They don't have access to these private Starlink hubs that you need in order to access the internet. There's such limited connection. It's gone down to 1% usage. What we heard before the blackout, or what I was hearing from a lot of my contacts, is that this is a very specific protest. This is a very different protest from the waves of protests we've seen against the regime in previous years, in the fact that it's very specific. They have an idea of what they do want, not just what they don't want. It's not that they just don't want the Islamic Republic and the regime and the corruption and the spending and the limits on freedom. No, they want a democratic state that will protect the rights of everybody.
You were describing how these protests began in the bazaar. They began in the shops with shopkeepers coming out. Just give us a sense from the people you've spoken to, what prompted that desperation? What has ordinary life become for citizens of Iran?
Well, because it was prompted from economic grievances, and it came from the bazaar in Tehran, which actually is normally aligned with the regime. It was a real break in tradition. So they're very dogged supporters of the current regime. And the fact that they flipped really told about what's the Iranian people are feeling on the streets. And that very quickly spread, and it left the economic zone, it left the shops and the electronic stores where it started, and very quickly spread to the young people, the students who were speaking out against Khomeini, to women, to the elderly. Of course, this was all sparked by the economic grievances, which came from inflation. It was at 50%. In fact, it was at 70% inflation for food. We saw a complete devaluation of the currency. In 1979, a dollar was worth 70 Iranian rials. Today, it's worth 1.47 million rials. That's a depreciation of more than 99%. This has affected even the elite, even the upper class. People are asking, why are we in this economic situation? Why do we have sanctions? Of course, the falling apart of the nuclear deal, which lifted some of those sanctions when Donald Trump ripped it up. The money has been spent on foreign wars, on foreign armies, on propping up dictatorships that have now fallen in Syria with Bashar al-Assad, with Lebanon and Hezbollah, the Shia militia Hezbollah, with Hamas, the Sunni militia in Gaza. This strategy that the regime doubled down on to stand up against the West and to stand up against Israel and the region has completely fallen apart. So the regime is in a very different place geopolitically. And the people are saying, you've been spending our money on this. But the war came to their doorstep in June. Tehran was evacuated. People were afraid. There was a loss of civilian life. Given that, and given the fact that they can't pay for bread and livelihood to support their families, all of that kind of compounded to a perfect storm, if you like. And that's what's brought Iranians from all walks of life onto the streets.
In the meantime, during this period, Donald Trump has made it quite clear that he's been talking to the Israeli government too, and there are plans being drawn up to strike Iran, depending on how things play out.
Have they crossed your red line yet to trigger a response?
No, they're starting to, it looks like, and there seem to be some people killed that aren't supposed to be killed. These are violent, if you call them leaders, I don't know if they're leaders or just they rule through violence. But we're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it, and we're looking at some very strong options. We'll make a determination.
When you've been speaking to protesters, how do they feel about that?
So we saw a change in position with Reza Shah Pahlavi, the son of the former king of Iran, who is currently living in the US, and he's an exiled opposition leader. A week ago, he was saying no to intervention. He was saying no to American intervention, no to foreign intervention. This must come from within. He's changed his position now. He's saying, just hold tight, America's coming. And he's welcoming intervention with open arms. A lot of Iranians that I've seen on social media are quite angry about that change, and they don't want intervention. Those that I spoke to, this is kind of Tehran, young people, students, this kind of Gen Z, people I've met on social media, they are saying that they do want intervention. They don't believe that change can happen without Donald Trump. Now, how that would look is also a question. What does intervention look like? Is it full-on military targeting of IRGC and regime-linked buildings? Or is it increased sanctions? There's a wide range of options on the table for US President Donald Trump, and I think he will want to avoid, and I think Iranians want to avoid as well, a full-blown war.
Gabby, as you say, it's increasingly hard to contact those protesters now with the internet down. How are they organising protests between themselves? How is that happening given the lack of contact?
It's a really good question. There are certain locations where people gather at certain times. We saw Pahlavi, the Crown Prince, calling to gather on Thursday night, which has coincided with the internet blackout and the government-orchestrated communications blackout, to stop people coordinating and to stop them getting information in. He called for gathering at 8 p.m. local time. He then made that a little bit earlier a few days later and said gather at 6 p.m. local time. But it is really difficult to get the message out. And the regime is also using their channels to get their message across to the people. So we're seeing certain videos being released from morgues of bodies piling up, of families being forced to search through the bodies to identify those who have been killed, to deter people from coming out on the streets. So when it comes to getting the message out, it's very, very difficult with no internet access. It's straight out of the regime's playbook, really, to impose an internet blackout and to stop coordination between the opposition. And that's what they've done in previous times as well. And I think the longest blackout that Iran saw was in 2019, which lasted 8 days. That was a very, very long blackout, and experts say if this lasts longer than 8 days, then it means the regime is doing very, very badly indeed.
Gabby, you mentioned some of those videos emerging of morgues and families looking for bodies, for loved ones. We have seen reports, obviously, in the last couple of days that the death toll has massively shot up to more than 500. Tell us a bit about what you've been hearing from the ground about the people being killed and some of the people who've become a victim of this regime.
So the conservative estimate is what you just brought up, the 500 people killed. We've seen numbers of up to 2,000 people or more from Iran International and from other rights organizations who are monitoring what's going on there. The same organization also says that over 10,600 people have been arrested. I've also been shared many videos and pictures of bodies, people shot in the head. Yesterday we wrote about Rubina Aminian. She's a 23-year-old fashion design student from Shariati University in Tehran. She joined the protests after finishing uni on a Thursday night, so on the night of the blackout and on the night of the first call by the Crown Prince to take to the streets. She went to the streets and she was shot dead in the back of the head. It took till yesterday, so till Sunday, for her family to identify her. It's one of the few cases, I think, where we are actually able to identify one of the dead, one of the killed, because there are innumerable bodies who haven't been counted and haven't been identified. So I think that was a really marked point for us in our coverage, where we got to see the personal damage. When you talk about numbers, 2,500, these numbers, they do touch us. But when we see videos and we see pictures and we hear names, I think it really brings home what people are fighting for and how brave they are.
Gabby, you explained how at the start, when these protests began in the Bazaar, the government actually sounded like they wanted to reassure the public that they understood, they were on their side. In the course of just a couple of weeks, how have we got to a stage where now the internet is blacked out and so many people are dying? What has the regime's response been? What are they saying?
They have become harsher and harsher in their rhetoric to the protesters, in their threats, in their efforts to clamp down. This is what they know. They've just gone back. They've just reverted to their previous methods. They are using them even stronger than before, because this is more people, and this is people from all walks of life. This time, the people have had enough. The government may well try to remove Khamenei in some way and bring in a different face, because he is seen as aged or unable to make good decisions, perhaps. But that won't be enough. That's not what the people want now.
My name is Rana Rahimpour. I'm an Iranian British journalist based in London.
Rana, watching these protests, how has it felt for you? Do they feel different to the protests you've seen in Iran before?
To be honest, I have covered enough protests in the course of my career, and I participated in enough protests when I lived in Iran myself, that I cannot get excited when protests happened in the sense that it will change things. So I have learned to be very cautious and wait to see how other factors play out before jumping into the conclusion that this is the end game, the regime is over, because the struggle for freedom in Iran has been going on for decades.
It's interesting, there is so much commentary internationally about how this could be the end game for the regime. But as you say, the protests have gone on for so much longer and have been bigger in the past. I mean, just take us back to the moment in 2009 when I think most people felt like it came closest to pushing for change. It's what we now call the Green Revolution. Just remind us of what was happening.
The year was 2009. There was a presidential election. One candidate was the then president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and the other candidate was Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was closer to the reformists at the time. There were widespread support for him. And a lot of people believed that the result of that election was stolen in favor of President Ahmadinejad. People came out in millions. But back then, people still believed in the ballot box, and they were chanting for their votes to be counted. The numbers were great. BBC's Persian TV, which had been just launched, and I was one of the reporters, was covering it from outside Iran, and we just couldn't believe our eyes. The whole city of Tehran was covered in green, which was the color of those protests. But back then, people weren't calling for regime change. They were very cautious about even chanting death to Khamenei. It only started later in those protests. I'd say that was the beginning of the end of a relationship between the Iranian regime and that part of the Iranian nation that is not supportive of the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, so if you wanted a more democratic solution, that was the moment you realized it couldn't happen within this regime.
Mm-hmm.
And the leaders of that revolution, as you say, are still behind bars. Tell us about some of the more recent protests, because over the years, they have broken out again. Just remind us of what happened in 2022.
September 2022, a young woman, she was 22 as well, she was killed in the custody of the religious police because she wasn't covering her hair properly. That started one of the most progressive protests in the history of the Islamic Republic. The slogan of those protests was "Woman by Freedom." And it started by women. Women were cutting their hair, they were setting their headscarf, which is the hijab is mandatory in Iran. They were setting it on fire. And some named those protests the first feminist revolution. A lot of people joined. We could see that the Iranian society was responding very differently. Men joined women. Men were supporting women in their quest for freedom. And I would say that that's probably represents the Iranian middle class more than any protests up to that point. Obviously, that was suppressed. Again, it didn't have a leader as such. But looking back, it seems that it succeeded in moving the Iranian society into a different place. Some people even refer to those protests as a cultural revolution that happened. So you would see a lot of women defying the rules. And don't forget, the regime is still trying to force women to wear the headscarf, but they have failed. So you would go to restaurants and cafes with seeing women defying those rules.
It was remarkable because, as you say, it has managed to shift the culture. Even though the law hasn't changed, the government hasn't changed, it shifted the culture, which would have given a lot of Iranians hope. And Rana, we should say these aren't the only protests that have been sparked by economic realities on the ground. In the meantime, there have been protests around petrol, around food prices, around the cost of living effectively. Over the years, we've seen many people in Iran quite dissatisfied to see, given the sanctions and how hard it is for citizens to buy the goods they need to survive, to see so much of the money Iran has going to support its proxies, like Hezbollah and Hamas and the other sort of institutions they propped up. In the meantime, these protests come at a time where all of those proxies, where the money was being funneled, have been massively weakened. Does that change the backdrop to these protests? Does that have an impact?
It has been the Islamic Republic's policy to support these proxies. And even though the leadership of these proxies have been assassinated or killed in various Israeli attacks over the last 2 years, they still exist amongst the population, especially in Lebanon. So Hezbollah has a strong support amongst the Shia part of the Lebanese society. And Iran continues to funnel money there. They have promised that they will rebuild those parts of the country that have been destroyed in Israeli attacks. And that has not changed. And that's one of the reasons why people are very angry. But the problem is that the Iranian supreme leader doesn't see himself as the leader of Iran. He sees himself as the leader of the Shias. So to him, this is a religious war between the Shias and then the rest of the world. That's why he doesn't care about spending the money in Iran for the Iranians, because for him, this is not a nationalist pursuit. This is a pursuit of helping the Shiites in the region to rise against Israel and sometimes the Sunni rivals in the region. And also he needs them in order to maintain his power inside the country. Over the last 2 weeks, we saw messages from his proxy groups, his Iraqi supporters, who said that we are ready to come inside Iran and support our leader, Ali Khamenei.
And how are those proxies viewed by ordinary Iranians right now?
They are deeply unpopular. Deeply unpopular. One of the slogans that we started hearing a few years ago, and we heard them in the last 2 weeks as well, is that no to Gaza, no to Lebanon. I would sacrifice my life for Iran, which is a message from the protesters to say that, that's not where the money should be spent. This is not our war. And I also think that one of the reasons that some of the protesters are gathering behind Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former king, is because they want to normalize relations with the rest of the world. They don't want these proxy wars. And at the moment, he's the one who is a symbol of that.
We'll talk about him in more detail in a moment. Before we do, though, you talked about those proxy wars across the region. Obviously, we've also had the Israel-Iran 12-day war. We have America and Israel making threats about potentially bombing now. How is that playing out on the ground? Is it helping the protesters or is it hindering them?
I don't want to speak on behalf of the protesters because, to be honest, I haven't even been able to speak with a single protester inside the country. Whatever we get are these little clips that are coming out. I think the fact that President Trump has threatened to intervene has given a bit of hope to those who are protesting. But again, the Iranian society is very diverse. We can't say that every protester who's out on the streets wants the same thing. On the other hand, we have people who are deeply against the Islamic Republic, but they don't believe in any military intervention. Because also there's a question, if President Trump starts bombing people and protesters are on the streets, the protesters are going to be killed. How are we going to protect those lives? So it's a very divisive policy, and it's very difficult to know what all these protesters think from afar.
Given the complicated geopolitics around all of this at the moment, do you think there is a chance that these protests will succeed where others have failed?
Realistically, I don't think protests alone can bring down the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic is probably the most sophisticated religious dictatorship in the history of the world. We've had harsher, worse religious dictatorships in the history, but they didn't have AI, they didn't have drones, they didn't have the kind of surveillance that the Islamic Republic has. So a combination of the technology, most of which have been provided by Russia and China, and the religious dogmatism and their belief that they are on a mission from God and from the hidden imam, and anybody who's against them is against God, and that they have to kill, together with the technology that they own, makes them one of the most dangerous dictatorships that we've ever seen, I think, in the history. So empty-handed protesters for them to be successful is really, really wishful thinking, unless they are ready to be killed in thousands, unless the whole country goes on a strike. And then at the next stage, we need the armed forces to join the protests. At this stage, the first bit might happen, but we haven't seen any signs that the armed forces are willing to switch sides or not even switch sides, to refrain from shooting people.
And Rana, there are very old links between Venezuela and Iran. They've both had to learn how to circumvent oil sanctions, and they've often sort of cooperated over the years. Do you think watching what happened to Maduro, will that have sent shockwaves through Tehran? Does that show how regime change might happen without it just coming from the protests? How worried will they be?
I'm sure they're worried, but they've been really worried since the Israeli attack as well. 12-day war, especially the first few days, Israel managed to kill dozens of very high-powered commanders of Iran's revolutionary guards. And I think since then, the Iranian supreme leader has been in hiding and is living in severe fear for his life. And that fear, together with the rhetoric and the threats from the United States and the kidnapping of President Maduro from Venezuela, puts the Islamic Republic in its weakest position. So what is fair is to say that the Islamic Republic has never been as weak as now, but I don't think it's weak enough to fall, at least not in the next few weeks.
Right. We do know there is the threat looming of American intervention. We're told there are deals being done in the background. What do you think might come of all of this? I mean, what would change look like in Iran?
There are so many possible scenarios. I think the biggest decision maker is going to be President Trump in this. And at the end of the day, the people who are protesting and unfortunately are being killed are not going to make that decision. At this stage, I feel President Trump wants negotiations with the Islamic Republic, because we know that all he cares about is either his own benefit or, secondly, the United States benefits. So what he wants is to cut off China from the heavily discounted Iranian oil, which was the same reason why he kidnapped President Maduro from Venezuela. And he would only go as far as that, in my view. We know that he's not very interested in the Middle East in the sense of interference in the internal affairs of these countries. So it now really depends on the Islamic Republic and how far they would go in giving in to this pressure from Donald Trump. So the question is, knowing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, he is one of the most stubborn people I've ever seen. He will destroy the country even further, but he is not going to back down. And the question is, how much pressure will his insiders be able to have him or potentially get rid of him? For some of the scenarios is either a coup by the Revolutionary Guards, unlikely, but a political coup by those elements of the Islamic Republic, like former President Rouhani, who's very keen on normalizing relations with the US, which of all the scenarios, I think this is probably the most plausible.
Really?
Because Iran has its proxies to the White House. Former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif is very close to many of these think tanks in Washington, D.C., and I think that it's not impossible that they're already in negotiations with the United States about a possible transition. But how that will unfold is a question. I think this is probably the most favorable scenario for President Trump as well, because it means regime change is very risky.
The man who is the son of the last Shah of Iran, living in exile in America, he has been making an appearance in these protests. How much support does he have, actually, in Iran? I mean, he's very popular with the diaspora, many of whom left Iran after the Shah. He seems to be very popular with the American government. He has good relations with the Israelis. Is he popular in Iran itself?
It's very difficult to know. One thing that is surprising is that we hear his name more than ever in these protests. But to give you an accurate picture, we need to have access to the country. To be honest, For a man who has lived most of his life and all of his adult life in California, never having a real job, never having to really manage anyone, never having to earn a penny, to think that he can now come to a country that is nothing compared to, he wouldn't know anything. Iran is unrecognizable from what he and his family fled from in 1979. He's not going to be in a position to run that country. If anyone can keep Iran together, if there will be an Iran, because there are other possibilities as well, but if there will be a unified Iran that will be in peace and prosperity, it's very unlikely that it will be led by a man who has never had a job all his life.
Do you think it might be a time for some of those leaders of the Green Revolution to return?
It's always been the time for them to return. But it's all in the hands of Donald Trump.
How does that feel, that it should be in the hands of Donald Trump and not the protesters risking their lives? I mean, for you, is this a hopeful moment as somebody who's in exile? You know, do you feel it's hopeful or is it quite frustrating that change is coming from America rather than Iran? And will anything change at all?
On a personal level, it's disappointing, Manveen. I have been less active in these round of protests. Before, I was very active, writing, interviewing, being very vocal about those protests. But when this happened, I thought, it's not my place. I'm living in the comfort of my life in London, in a stable economy and a stable democracy. So it's not my place to tell those who are inside the country struggling what to choose, but a future that is determined by the United States, and especially Trump's United States, that is not the future I want for Iran. So, on personal level, I'm watching it. I wish for the Iranians to win the freedom they deserve, but I can't say that I am very happy or excited. I am just watching with concern. There is a poem in Persian that says, از هر طرف که رفتم جز وحشتم نیفزود. And it means, whichever side that I look, it just gives me more fear.
That was Rana Rahimpour, a British-Iranian journalist here in London. And before that, Gabrielle Weiniger, who reports from The Times from the Middle East. The producers today were Harry Stott and Michaela Arneson. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.